Is the state of your church strong? We're asking that question today on the Church Revitalization Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the Church Revitalization Podcast, brought to you by the Malphurs Group team, where each week we tackle important, actionable topics to help churches thrive. And now, here's your hosts, Scott Ball and AJ Matthew.
Welcome to the Church Revitalization Podcast. My name is Scott Ball. I'm joined by my friend and co-host, AJ Matthew. AJ, we are talking about the state of your church. It's a State of the Union address this week. By the time this podcast releases, people will have heard whether or not the State of the Union is strong here in the United States. For our global listeners, we have a speech every year that, I don't know, I have no idea how much do the people who don't live here pay attention to our news cycle. Just Google it.
I don't know.
But we thought it would be a good touch point today because we actually have a year's worth of data. We going into 2021, we updated our church ministry analysis and started collecting data in a new way. And so we have a year's worth of that. And we thought it might be good to share the results, the collective results of that, and then let you kind of figure out what's the state of our church. How would our church stack up to those averages? Would be doing better or worse? And we also wanted to maybe highlight some of the interesting trends that were really evident across all of the churches that participated in the church ministry analysis in the last year. So that's kind of what we're doing today.
Yeah, it's fun. I kind of like data. I like talking about data points. I think that's cool. So, and I hope our listeners pay more attention to the data on their churches than they do the data on the United States of America, honestly, especially the global audience. I hope you don't know that much about what's going on over here because you don't really need to. And I wish you were more informed about the state of the church.
The state of your church specifically.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So a little bit of background on this. We do a survey with churches called the Church Ministry Analysis. All the churches that we work with do that. And then a lot of churches that we don't work with do that. They just want to gather data and get in touch with us to help them do that. And this has been happening since, I think, since Dr. Malphurs wrote Advanced Strategic Planning over 20 years ago. And so lots of churches have done that. We don't have data going back all those years. And the church ministry analysis evolved over time to, ask better questions in better ways. And it's been over a year now, Scott, right? On the church ministry analysis 2.0.
Yeah, just over about 14 months.
So we reworked the church ministry analysis over a year ago and began with consistent data collection in a way in which we could analyze that data, the aggregate over time with all the churches that we work with. And so now that we've got a year's worth, we thought it would be good to go back and reflect on this, talk about it a little bit, and give you some information about the churches that have taken the church ministry analysis with the Malphurs Group. So I think it's pretty interesting stuff.
So in today's show notes, which you'll find at malphursgroup.com/129, I'm going to include all of the various average scores for each section of the church ministry analysis, so you can see those. But what we wanted to do in the podcast today is more or less just kind of discuss the implications of what these results mean. Mm-hmm. And I think maybe as just a starting point of discussion, AJ, when we went back and looked at the average decline, it's, we want to say that 80% of churches, or I guess the common thought was 80% of churches are plateaued or declining. And our data backs that up to some degree. That prior to the pandemic, we were asking churches for information from 2015 to 2019. So we had, roughly 5 years of attendance data. Attendance with the churches that participated in our church ministry analysis, it was mostly stagnant or slightly declining.
Yeah,
that would be, there were, there's variances in churches. So we're just looking at the average. On the average, churches were declining by they declined by something like 5%. over the course of 5 years. So not super steep decline prior to the pandemic, which I think is interesting. I mean, it jives with the plateau or declining. They're certainly not growing. There wasn't a single church that was like skyrocketing that participated in our survey anyway.
Yeah, right. I mean, we do need to consider the churches that typically contact us to begin with. And it's, while sometimes it is healthy churches that are doing well and they want to just organize, they're working on fine tuning and want to do even better. But that's a minority. Most churches that contact us are plateaued or declining. They've got some fear happening on the future state of their church, and they're looking to change what's happening.
That's right. And I think what's maybe more interesting or frightening is that since the pandemic, the decline accelerated, which is not going to be news to anybody who's listening to this podcast because you've probably seen it in your church. But we have less data for all of 2021, obviously, because it's just now 2022, March 2022. But for the ones that we do have data for, AJ, there was from 2019 to 2022, through 2021. So theoretically, a chance for some of the pandemic losses to come back in person. There's about a 40% decrease in the churches that we have. And it's a small subset right now. But this jives with what I've seen other places and other data sets. The number is somewhere or at least 30%. So it's worse than that with the churches that have participated with us. But again, it's a small data set right now for churches that we have complete data for 2021.
Yeah, I think this immediately gives us, an interesting snapshot of just overall considering the church that, that we had a plateaued to declining trend prior to COVID. And COVID, I would have to say, decimated the church. I don't think that's an understatement to say, as far as attendance metrics go. And so, part of the question I think that we want to kind of ask today is how much better prepared is your church today than it was in 2019 for a crisis? And I think the other overall, for me personally, at least, Scott, I think you agree with me based on the data and personal experience, the crisis that COVID was in the church highlighted a discipleship issue prior to COVID, and that we had not grown people in their faith to the point of weathering that level of storm. Now, overall, personally, we can't speak to people's personal experience in how they handled what was their personal prayer life like, or their study of the scriptures and things like that. But as far as their engagement with church in some degree of, either attending church to the degree they were allowed to, depending on their personal geography and policies in place, but also their engagement in whatever kind of, small group activity or something might have been available to them at the time, because that's what we saw a huge decline in as well. Basically, people were disconnected from the church. We're bringing that back to, with some supporting data, the level of maturity and discipleship that people had achieved up to 2019 that would have just had them in a place in their life where they're like, okay, this is a tough situation, but I need to be rooted still in my church. And that's what we're able to look at. How rooted were people still in their church? So I don't want people to say, well, my faith increased. It probably did. But we don't have metrics for the level in which people's personal faith increased. We have metrics for the level in which they engaged with their church. And I think you could draw some correlations.
For sure. I think, so let me give some background for those of you that don't know. We've talked about the church ministry analysis on the podcast before, but what do we measure? So we obviously we're getting some top line metrics on attendance and giving and those kinds of things, but we were looking for deeper trends around discipleship and church health. And so we talk about all the time on the podcast these fundamentals of church health, which for us are being Great Commission focused, having actionable and healthy biblical core values, building out a discipleship pathway, a way for people to actually grow as a disciple, a clear and compelling vision for the future that the whole church understands and rallies around, having clear strategies and ways to execute them, systems for executing them, and then leadership. So having a healthy leadership culture that develops more and better leaders. So those are 6 things that we look at, and we measure them in the church ministry analysis by asking some key questions that measure how well your church is doing in each of those 6 areas right now. So let me briefly hit the top line numbers, AJ, on those. Yeah. And our scores go from 0 to 100 is the range. You should not think of these scores like you would a score for like in school. It's almost, it'd be almost impossible to get like a 90 or above. In fact, it'd be almost impossible to get an 80 or above. If you're getting into the 70s or above, that's really good. So that's like exceptionally good. So just for a barometer of what would be a good score. So what were our averages in each of these areas? Let me just hit those, AJ, and then I think we just want to reflect generally on what these mean. So the overall health average was 57. And the average for how well churches were doing as it relates to Great Commission focus, 66. As it relates to how healthy our core values are and how evident they are, 62. For discipleship pathway effectiveness, 50. Clarity of vision, 52. Strategy, so how good are we at creating plans and executing them, 57. And then leadership culture, 54. So, AJ, I think let's start by discussing the fact that mission in almost every church is the highest scoring area. Mm-hmm. Why do you think that is? What's that a reflection of?
Well, to be fair, there's a lot of churches that have good stated missions. They know what's right, or at one time a group of leaders got together knowing what was right and put that forth as the church's mission. But I think, thinking through, because in our analysis, there's places for people to just write in, they can express themselves in regards to these questions. And I think overall, people are in agreement that the church has a Great Commission mission statement. But then as you go down into that, you see them less and less say that it's communicated well and that it's lived out well. It still keeps that overall score for mission higher in the survey. So, the people know what the right answer is. Their actions don't always line up with it.
Yeah, totally. In fact, so within each of these, we ask, it depends on the section. There's a varying number of questions. But in this section, I think there's 6 questions, and almost always there's a pretty high score on does the church, a question around. I'm not telling you this is how it's phrased. It's something like this, but does the church have a mission statement, that's centered on the Great Commission? And we put in parentheses what the Great Commission is, so that some people maybe aren't aware what that is or what that means. But there's another question that you're kind of touching on this, AJ, that asks about how effectively are we living that out? And it's a different story. That one usually, that's what drives the score down from being in the 80s to getting down to that average of 66, is there is a self-awareness of the fact that we maybe aren't living out the mission statement that's printed on the front of our bulletin or on our website or on a banner in the lobby.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's not enough. The conclusion is it's not enough to create a good mission statement. You have to strategize around how you're going to live that mission out. Bottom line.
Right.
So the next thing.
Go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think if you want to go down to the worst, I think maybe people would be inclined to think that the lowest area. So if the highest is mission, and we're saying, hey, we're a church that's about the Great Commission and making disciples, you probably would not assume that the lowest scoring area is around discipleship. You probably would have thought that that's maybe somewhere in the middle. You would not have assumed that it's the lowest. Probably people would have thought that the lowest scoring area would be vision, or maybe leadership, which those are the two second lowest. And we can talk about that in a little bit, but the lowest is around discipleship. So our highest is saying we're about making disciples, and the lowest is making disciples.
Yeah.
What does that say?
Yeah. Well, I think so. A little another important piece to just talk about how we work through this stuff. So Great Commission, I mean, we're talking about the Matthew 28 passage, because there's several Great Commission passages in the New Testament, but so we're specifically talking about go and make disciples of all nations, ... teach them to obey everything I've commanded you. So go make disciples, this evangelistic aspect, and then teach them to obey everything that I've commanded you, this edification aspect, this what we would probably just consider the discipleship piece of it. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of churches are saying that that's what they're about, but they haven't developed a structure to actually do that. And I think that's missed even in a lot of churches, the necessity to even think of it that way. Because I think so many churches have just been doing what they've done just for a long time. All right. We have a worship service, we have Sunday school, or we have small groups. For a lot of places, that's just kind of it. And there's not been forethought given to like, really what can we accomplish within this framework that we're presently living in? And is there a better way that we could structure ourselves for a desired outcome? And which is more so what the eye-opening moment is in going through our strategic envisioning process. It's like, okay, yeah, we've been doing some good things, but we've not been doing the right things to achieve an outcome. And the data reflects that. We know what we should be about. We're not producing the outcome that one would desire. And many churches don't even know that. They don't even realize that until kind of looking at it in black and white in a report that this is an area that we're not doing well in. And, so if you're not effectively making disciples, how effectively then could your church be growing, right? So we begin to paint the picture of why the church's state may be where it presently is, in a plateau or declining environment, because we're not getting the outcomes that we want. If we were excelling at making disciples, would we not see an increasing trend line? I think it's fair to say that we would, however steep that may be, depending on the church's individual context. But this is an issue.
It is an issue. And I think the struggle is that so many churches can't break free from a program-oriented way of thinking. Like they can't start thinking about process-oriented discipleship. They're stuck in thinking in a program-oriented discipleship way. And so they have no other framework for processing it, despite the fact that the results are self-evident, that they are not working, that it's not producing the discipleship fruit. The very prospect of doing something different is frightening. And I can actually empathize a little bit with this. I've talked about this, I think, some on the podcast, just on a personal level, as it relates to, I think a great analogy to this is just personal health. It's like knowing what you need to do, what you ought to do. If I were to make these switches, to these lifestyle changes, I know that would produce a better outcome for my health. But it's so much easier to operate in the way that I've been operating. And despite the fact that, your cholesterol is whatever it is, or your weight is whatever it is, it's so much easier just to operate with what you know. And to break free from that paradigm of what's easiest or what's most comfortable, and to do something that is actually going to produce a better result, is difficult. And so I think I just want to say I can empathize with churches that it can be difficult to break free from these things, but that's not an excuse not to do it. Mm-hmm. And it really boils down to, do we actually care about making disciples? You can't fret and go, oh, we're declining. Oh, we're plateaued. Oh, we lost 30% during COVID, and then not do something about it. You either have to just kind of throw your hands up and go, it is what it is, and I'm just going to accept what it is and just kind of surrender yourself to that. Or you have to be willing to put in the work to make the changes. And I think really that's the value of doing a church ministry analysis for your church, is because you're able to then point to hard numbers and go, and not hard numbers, not being the attendance numbers, hard sort of church health scores, and go, do you see that our church is not making disciples? This is the problem.
Yeah. It requires a few fundamental questions, for the leadership of the church to ask. Do we know where we are? Do we know what the state of our church is? Do we care what the state of our church is?
Yeah, that's maybe the more important question.
Yeah.
Not just do we know, but do we care?
Yeah. And then do we want to do anything differently to achieve different results is the final question. And it has to be asked, and we do ask it. Whenever we do a church ministry analysis, we collect the data, we compile a report, we meet with the church leaders, we discuss the report, they have a copy of the report. And the last question has to be, do you want to do anything to improve this? Whether you do it with us or not.
Right. That's a good point to make. Like we have a number of churches that we can think of a few instances where churches did act on the data, but they did it in a way that wasn't directly working with us.
Yeah.
That's great. We care about is that you act on the data.
Right.
That's the most important thing to us.
Yeah. And unfortunately, there are a lot of churches that even in the face of hard data, they don't have the strength to move forward with change. And that's unfortunate. Yeah.
So I think the biggest the top line, shock to me when we compiled this data, AJ, was because it even busted some of my own assumptions, despite the fact that I've done lots and lots of these reports, is that the pathway number was the lowest. Mm-hmm. The discipleship number was the lowest. I was not surprised about the mission number being the highest, because I know that every time I do a report, it's going to be the highest. What I'd like to talk about, shift for a few minutes to discuss, AJ, is the fact that the vision and the leadership component. Mm-hmm. The vision, I believe, is the second.
Yeah, it's the
second lowest.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So this should not come as a huge surprise, probably to a lot of our listeners, right? I mean, vision is a big topic. A lot of pastors like to think about vision, talk about vision. So despite the fact that there are countless books on vision, you hear about it all the time, why is it so lacking in our churches? And what is the impact of that?
Yeah, right. Well, the impact is clear. And so let's definitely define vision here. We've already talked about mission, being Great Commission focused. We talk about mission being kind of the path that the church is on. And that's the journey. It's the road trip through our faith existence. Vision is the destination. Where exactly are we going on this? What do we foresee the future? How are we perceiving the future that we believe God has sovereignly envisioned for us? Mm-hmm. So, said another way, why are we here? What's our church here to do? God has placed our church at this address, this piece of dirt on his earth, and surrounded us with these people. What do we need to do? In so many churches, they don't even think about that. What could the future look like if we're really doing well with what we know God wants us to do? What kind of environmental changes, and when I say environmental, I mean overall cultural changes could we make? And it's a challenge, because it's just not one of those things that we can just say, well, this is just it. It takes prayer, it takes consideration, it takes discussion among the members in trying to perceive, as I said, what exactly does God want us to do here? But the importance of vision can't be overstated, because it's what really begins to drive the church together in unity towards a common goal, and build momentum and excitement. And so while it may be the hardest piece to do, it probably would be the biggest piece in progress towards achieving these goals, if we're able to really put this together and speak about it in a clear and simple way. So yeah, the pathway discipleship pathway is part of the strategy. It's like mission says we know what we need to be doing. Pathway is how we're going to do it, in addition to other strategies that play into this. And vision is what's the output going to be. So we've got to compile these things together to really even clarify what our strategies should be. Because if we don't know where we're going, then that's hard to achieve.
One of the questions that we get oftentimes when we're starting to work with the church, or when they're in sort of an exploratory phase on strategic envisioning, they'll ask, well, how do you handle if in the vision process there's disagreement on the vision? And sometimes there's disagreement on the vision, but very often there's not. The biggest challenge that we see is not so much that there's a misalignment in vision, but that the question was never asked in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a lot of unity that can come just by asking the question, where are we going exactly? And then putting pen to paper and then start actually talking about that. Talk about where you're going. Talk about what the future could look like. And so that's not to say that there won't be some people who have disagreements about things. There will, but that's a very small minority of people in your church. Most people are going to want to go where you're going. So the question really is not, is there a vision or is there disunity in our church? The real question is, have you asked the vision question as a church? Have you discussed this at all in the first place? And then very likely you're going to find some common ground, and asking the question and going through the process of writing it out and detailing it and describing the future can be something that builds and generates unity within your church. So it would be interesting for you maybe to find out as it relates to vision right now, where you're at right now in your church. How would you score? The average score is 52. So is that better or worse in your church, do you think? Last one I want to talk about, AJ's leadership.
Okay. Yeah. Important.
Yeah, it's important. So this was the third lowest scoring thing on average. And we often package, like you may have downloaded this on our website because there's a pop-up about it, I think. But we talk about mission, values, pathway, vision, and strategy as the 5 fundamentals of church health. And we believe that you really need these 5 things to put together a church health plan, so to speak. But leadership is the activator of that plan. It's the activator of church health. So it's essential to church health, but it's if you want to think of it like there's the strategic plan part of it, which is mission, values, pathway, vision, strategy. And then there's the who's going to do the plan component. And that's what leadership is. You all may have heard me use this analogy before, but it's like having a light fixture that's pointed at a stage, and you can have everything lined up just right, but you're not going to really have vision, and you're not really going to be making an impact unless you have a light bulb in that light fixture. And leadership is that light bulb. And when the light bulb is burned out or missing, then you're not going to, or burned out, missing, it's going to, you're not going to make the impact that you want to have. And so I guess this is a personal passion of mine, AJ, that for so many churches, the leadership component is the missing piece. And in fact, the churches, sorry, I'll let you say something here, but what's interesting is that the churches that scored the highest on the CMA overall, so their scores were the best. The one area where they tended to score their lowest scoring area was very often leadership. So they had a lot of good things in place, but the gap for them was on the leadership side.
Yeah, and it's important to note that gap on leadership potential and leadership effectiveness doesn't miraculously just get better. And so going through, the strategic envisioning process, church health process that we take churches through, just the act of doing that doesn't magically make leadership improve. It takes active participation on leadership parts to look differently at the areas where they might have had weaknesses, and to perform differently in the future in regards to those. And that then will become the catalyst for change in the church, for not only pursuing change, but effectively accomplishing positive, healthy change in the church. Because it's possible for a church to go through a health strategic planning process, come out with some great ideas, and then still have weak leadership that won't move it forward. And that to me that's kind of like the biggest tragedy of any church that we would work with, that would be the case, that a team would put in a lot of work, and leadership, many times faced with resistance, will fall away and not allow change to happen. So hate when that happens. So we certainly want to build up leaders as we're working with them, either just in strategic envisioning, when we have, opportunity just to get to know leadership, do some personal encouragement, or through leadership pipeline development, when we really get into structure of leadership and build more of a framework so that good decision-making can be made within that framework. Kind of prop up maybe some weaker leaders into a framework in which they'll at least be faced with maybe the best options of decision-making, instead of being left on their own and not perceiving what the best decision even should be to consider.
Right. Totally. So to kind of put a lid on this, to wrap this thing up, a bow, I should say, not a lid, a bow, to put a bow on it. The state of your church, is it strong? That's what we want to know. And that's what we want you to know. So our average churches that's working with us was moderately unhealthy. We have these sort of categories: healthy, moderately unhealthy, moderately healthy, and healthy. And almost every church scored in the moderately unhealthy category, some on the lower end of that, some on the upper end, but mostly kind of squarely in the middle of the moderately unhealthy category. And so if you would like to know what's the state of your church, how would you stack up? We're doing a 1 week only 50% off the church ministry analysis, which is already just $99. So that's going to take it down to like $49 or something like that.
$49.50.
And so we would encourage you to do this. It's costs nothing. Basically, it's very, very inexpensive. And this is not, we've talked about this on the podcast before, but I want to emphasize this. Our church ministry analysis is not something that you fill it out and then you just get an auto-generated report. One of our guides combs through all of the comments, all of the data points, and then writes a report, a custom report just for your church. So with specific sort of application on next steps, what you should do. And we may recommend the strategic envisioning process to you, but like we talked about earlier in the podcast, we just want you to act on the data. So we're going to give you good things that you can apply either with us or on your own. And it will give you an idea of what the state of your church is right now. And now you could go back to this episode and see how do we stack up according to the averages, maybe better, maybe worse. But one of the reasons why we haven't done this in the past, AJ, is that we don't really care how your church stacks up against other churches. We want you to know, how is your church stacking up against its full potential? And are you as healthy as you can be? Are you as effective in making and maturing disciples as you can be? That's really the only metric that matters in our view. And we want to help you with that. So if you go to malfersgroup.com/CMA and use the code STATE, STATE, that'll give you 50% off now through we'll say next Wednesday. So that'd be March 9th if you're listening to this in real time. And if you're listening to this in future years, it's past March 9th, 2022, and you're like, man, I'd like to do this, but the only way I can do it is if I were to get 50% off, email us at leadership@malfersgroup.com and we'll work something out with you. We don't want money to be the reason why anybody doesn't get the help that they need, but we're going to make a special push right now. If you need an extra incentive, go to malfersgroup.com/CMA, use the code STATE, STATE, in the coupon code box. That'll give you 50% off for the next week. And if you'd like to get more details on the church ministry analysis averages and get those numbers and some descriptions of that, you can go to malfersgroup.com/129. And that's going to have our full show notes for today. That's going to include the averages for each of those sections and a brief description of that. AJ, any other closing thoughts?
Thanks for being with us. We exist to help improve the state of your church. That's our ministry that God has called us to. It's what we work on every day. So thanks for listening today. I hope it was helpful, and I hope it makes you think a little bit. We'd love to help you get the data that you need to make good decisions for your church to make and mature more disciples of Jesus. God bless you.